Donald Trump claims inflation is gone, yet at the supermarket, prices are anything but stable. How can inflation be over when it's still right there on the receipt? In this video, we'll untangle why prices keep rising, even as political leaders declare victory, and how decisions about tariffs, trade, and central bank independence shape the bill you pay for groceries, not just in the United States, but in Canada and beyond. We'll look at three things specifically. What's really happening with inflation and why it feels different than the headlines, how tariffs and trade policy, especially with Canada, are quietly fueling higher costs, and why central bank independence isn't just a technicality, but a guardrail for every ordinary person's paycheck. Before we get into it, as usual, let's consider a question to mull over while you watch this video. We all talk about prices rising. They're rising all the time. But are you aware of any factors or circumstances that might actually make prices fall? Have you ever witnessed something getting actually cheaper? Think about it, put it down in the comments, and we'll discuss this in the end. Let's start not in the White House, but at the checkout counter. Step into any supermarket, anywhere from Chicago to Toronto, and you'll find that the official numbers, 3%, 4%, are almost irrelevant to the lived reality. In the US, coffee is up 21%, audio equipment 12%, living room furniture 10%, toilet paper 5%, and perhaps most relevant, groceries broadly up by a figure that doesn't fit on a campaign poster. Briefly, let's just discuss what this actually means, because for the longest time it confused me, and it's not like it's taught in schools. Inflation is essentially a measure of how fast things get more expensive over time. For example, if a phone was $100 last year, and phone inflation since last year is 10%, then this year the phone is $110. It's not a reflection on whether things feel cheaper or expensive, rather it's just a comparison between these numbers between last year and this year. You'll also hear the term headline inflation, which is essentially just a broad and overall measure of inflation that includes most things that on average people tend to be buying. That's food, energy, transportation, clothes. And the headline inflation just a few days ago in the USA was reported to be 2.9%. This is not what we wanted to see. In fact, we want to see a number as close as possible to 2%. And now that I'm explaining all this, I realize that I'm getting a bit derailed. So if you do want a proper breakdown video on inflation, GDP, interest rates, and how all of that ties together politically, please let me know in the comments. I think I'd actually enjoy making one of those. Anyway, this is why when politicians declare mission accomplished on inflation, whatever that means, ordinary people, left, right, or center, simply don't believe it because their own experiences don't necessarily reflect a neat little number, whatever the number is. They are not wrong. Numbers, when wielded as weapons, can always be massaged here and there. But the totality of prices, week after week, has a certain stubborn honesty. When Trump proclaims no inflation, too late, lower the rate, it's definitely a nice show, but it's also a bit of a test. Can the executive branch, by force of will, declare a problem solved? If only it worked that way, life would be so simple, wouldn't it? The free will of a president forming an economic reality for us all overnight. That's more, what, magic? But why are prices staying high or rising again, even after the so-called corrections of the post-pandemic era? This is where Canada may paint a part of the USA picture that you won't find it on the campaign trail. Much of today's USA inflation is imported. It's a feedback loop built by design, yet rarely acknowledged in the debate. Over the last year, the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on trading partners, China, Europe, and yes, Canada. You probably all know this by now. The logic was to protect American manufacturing, boost local jobs, punish unfair trade practices. But the effects have been, let's say, a bit of a mixed bag. What you get isn't a headline-grabbing crisis, but a slow, steady surcharge on almost everything. American companies now pay more for raw materials, for parts, for finished goods, sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. Naturally, they pass that extra cost right down the line. Meanwhile, Canadian exporters facing those same tariffs don't just shrug and absorb the hit. They either raise prices or look for ways to push those costs back across the border. So what starts off as a political move to look tough on trade ends up as a kind of invisible tax on both sides of the relationship. And while politicians may care about optics and re-elections, the actual economy doesn't happen in the government. It happens among the people. It's not really a dramatic thing, at least not in the sense of breaking news, but it shows up everywhere. A slightly higher bill at the grocery store, a washer-dryer set that's just a bit more expensive, a construction project that runs over budget. You don't see a headline about it, but you do feel it when you check out at the register or try to replace a fridge. And while the big stories tend to focus on a few thousand jobs saved or lost, the real impact is spread quietly, almost anonymously, across millions of households and businesses. The price shock, rather than being a single event, flows both ways. Canadian inflation has tracked the US pretty closely, but with a little twist. Canada's economy, being smaller and more vulnerable to these sorts of global currents, actually shrank last quarter. We have a full video on what that actually means. Check it out for the deep dive. This means real pain for ordinary Canadians who now face fewer choices and a more uncertain recovery. In this sense, tariff policy is a blunt instrument. It's not America first or Canada first. It's cost inflation first and foremost. Everybody pays for the privilege of pretending these walls keep the problems out. If you want to support this kind of analysis, one that actually traces the feedback loops between countries, not just talking points, there's a Ko-fi link below. Every contribution helps. I'm also writing a book on how to think clearly in a world that often doesn't want you to. If that sounds like something you'd want to read, there's a quiet little sign-up link in the description. The irony in the US is that in the effort to look strong on the world stage, America has ended up importing one of the oldest economic headaches around: cost-push inflation. This is the kind of inflation that happens when the cost of making things, raw materials, transportation, energy, wages, starts rising sharply, and businesses pass those costs on to consumers. It's inflation that begins on the supply side, not the demand side. So even if demand slows down, prices can still rise. And for Canada, the ripple effects are even sharper: slower growth, higher costs, fewer options at the border, and a recovery that always feels just out of reach. It's really economic pain for both countries, right now at least. So the next time you see a headline blaming supply chain issues or pointing the finger at greedy corporations, remember these forces are real, but they're often symptoms, not causes. Policy choices, especially tariffs, aren't abstract. They ripple through the economy the way a sudden cold snap moves across a continent. You can try to wall yourself out, but inflation, like the weather, finds its way in. This brings us to a quieter, less theatrical part of the story, yet possibly the most consequential of all. It's tempting for presidents of all stripes to treat the central bank like a mere branch of government. Trump is not unique in this, but his public broadsides against Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, whom he himself appointed, are unusually brazen. Powell is a disaster who doesn't have a clue. Lower the rate now. In my personal view, this kind of language is deeply problematic and inappropriate among all of us, let alone coming from somebody holding a position that's ideally meant to be a role model for us. Here's why this kind of thinking is dangerous, not just for economists, but for all of us. Central banks were invented to take the hardest, most politically explosive decisions about money, interest rates, and inflation out of the hands of politicians who face elections every few years and put them in the hands of technocrats who face only the math. Central banks are apolitical, very serious, and data-driven. Of course, throughout history, there have been brave people who've decided to test the limits of this. But hey, bravery is only a line away from poor judgment, and sadly, history is littered with disasters where this line was blurred. Argentina in the 1980s, hyperinflation fueled by politicians pressuring the central bank to print more money. The result was, of course, entire life savings erased. Turkey in the 2010s, a president replaces central bank governors at will, insists on unorthodox policies, inflation soars, currency collapses. Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, political interference leads to 79 billion % inflation. Money becomes less valuable than paper itself. The United States and Canada are not on the brink of hyperinflation. Don't worry, they are far, far from this. But the lesson is clear. Once leaders start interfering with the Fed, rewriting the rules, or simply disregarding expert warnings in favor of slogans or optics, the message to markets is simple. Stability is now political, not structural. The more fundamental question really is, do you want the truth of reality or a lie that looks good? I cover this in the book as well, by the way. In these kinds of events, investors may demand higher interest to compensate for the risk. Mortgage rates may rise, the cost of business loans may also climb, and once confidence in the central bank is shaken, it's very hard to restore. It's like trust. Once broken, it's sort of hard to rebuild. Canada, for all its challenges, offers a quiet contrast here. The Bank of Canada's independence, sometimes infuriating to politicians, has helped insulate the country from the wildest swings of political cycles. It's not perfect, but it is predictable. And in economics, predictability is half the battle. If you're enjoying this, I'd love it if you subscribe. The House of L is a community of thoughtful, curious people, and you're very welcome here. It's easy, sometimes dangerously easy, to turn inflation into a kind of political shorthand or to pretend there is just one villain to blame. But really, inflation is more like a web of interconnected trade-offs. Let's be fair, the idea of wanting more goods made in America, of aiming for a more balanced economy that isn't just built on services and digital products, actually makes a certain kind of sense. Manufacturing can mean more stable jobs, stronger supply chains, and a bit less vulnerability in global shocks. But, and here's the key, it's not something you can flip on overnight. Moving a massive economy like the United States in a new direction is a multi-decade project, not a one-term fix. Factories take years to build, supply chains take even longer to rewire. This is the sort of thing that requires patience, investment, good debate, consensus. And here's where the trade-offs come in. If you want more things made at home, you almost always pay more for them. That's not a failure of policy, it is just how math and markets work these days. Tariffs are one way to try to nudge the country in that direction, but tariffs come with real costs as well. When you put up barriers to imports, the price of goods tends to rise, first for businesses, then for ordinary households. The impact doesn't show up in a single factory ledger. It turns up in millions of grocery carts and online orders. So yes, there is something appealing about the big promise of bringing manufacturing back, but the path to that goal is long, complicated, and honestly a little bit slow. If you want to nudge the US economy towards more production, it might mean investing in skills training, in new infrastructure, in regional partnerships with countries like Canada and Mexico, rather than just relying on tariffs. There is no quick fix for this, and in my personal view, I'm not even sure it's even broken. But hey, if the US leadership is determined to go for that, we need a series of hard choices, each with their own costs. And of course, if leaders claim that inflation is over, whatever that means, before people actually feel relief at the checkout, that only deepens public cynicism. People notice the gap between what they're told and what they experience. This is a real persistent vulnerability for any government. If you look at Canada, the lesson is clear. Tariffs meant to protect an economy can end up hurting growth, shrinking options, and backfiring in unexpected ways. At the end of the day, economic interdependence, once dismissed as globalist, is really just reality. We only tend to notice it when it starts to slip away. So, circling back to that question from the start, have you ever actually seen prices fall? Like properly, noticeably, meaningfully fall? It's rare, I know, but it does happen. Sometimes it can be because of technology, the classic example being TVs. Remember when flat screens used to cost a fortune? Now you can get a 40-inch for less than a week's groceries because of scale and innovation. Other times it's because something weird happens, like too much supply flooding the market. Think oil prices during COVID. Planes weren't flying, roads were empty, and suddenly crude oil was basically free-ish. That didn't last long, of course, but it was technically a price collapse for the time being. Then there's good old competition. A new company enters the market, undercuts everyone else, and you see your mobile bill or streaming subscription suddenly drop, not out of kindness, but because they want your loyalty. And every now and then, governments intervene. Subsidies, tax cuts, changes in regulation. Maybe insulin gets cheaper, maybe electricity does. But again, that depends on where you live and what kind of political will exists. So yes, it can happen, but most of the time, those are little islands of relief in a sea of rising prices. And that's why inflation sticks in the mind. It's everywhere and it is relentless. The Canadian lesson, perhaps, is that no economy is immune from global shocks or bad decisions made elsewhere. Tariffs meant to protect can instead shrink economies. Central banks, when left alone, are boring by design, and that is their actual virtue. As for the US, a president can declare no inflation 1,000 times, but the receipt and analysis remains. If you want to understand why prices stay high, don't just watch the speeches, watch the design of policy, of institutions, of trade. For more on how US tariffs are quietly backfiring and for a deeper look at the Canadian economy's recent shrinkage, you'll find both of those videos here. The real story of inflation is always unfinished, always upstream of politics, and always visible if you look closely enough. Stay safe, my friends. Keep your arguments nuanced, remain data-driven, and remember, we all make the daily choice whether to engage in the truth of reality or the manufacturing of a lie that's more gentle.